On live TV in front of 4 million viewers, Pete Hegseth mocked a 34-year-old African leader Ibrahim Traoré with a smirk. But just 90 seconds later, Traoré said one sentence that made even Congress pause. What kind of power turns humiliation into history? It was just past 8:00 p.m. Eastern Time. The Fox News studio gleamed under cold blue lights. The flags behind the desk hung like polished stage props, silent, purposeful, and immovable. Across millions of living rooms in America, the network's signature alert flashed across TV screens. Tonight, a new African strongman. And then there he was, Pete Hegseth, confident, composed, eyes sharp behind the studio lighting, dressed in his signature navy suit, patriotic Thai voice clipped with the unmistakable cadence of a man certain he's right. He leaned forward as if preparing for battle. Let's stop pretending this Ibrahim Traoré guy is some heroic reformer. He began, lips tight with disdain. This isn't a grassroots revolution. This is strongman cosplay, military fatigues, fiery speeches, and anti-Western theatrics. And make no mistake, folks, this man is not a friend to American interests. The screen behind him shifted to a photo. Ibrahim Traoré, young, stern-faced, wearing camouflage, a red beret pulled down sharply across his brow. The image flickered, then zoomed in slowly, dramatically. Pete continued, "This is not about race. It's about reality. Traoré leads a government that's more militant than democratic, more firebrand than statesman. He's aligned with Russia. He's shut out France. And if you think his brand of neo-nationalism will stay inside Burkina Faso, think again." He paused just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. What we're seeing here is the birth of a new ideological axis, and it's anti-Western at its core. Cut, commercial. But the moment had already landed like a thunderclap. Within minutes, clips of Pete's segment were circulating on YouTube and TikTok. On the surface, it was just another firebrand monologue from a cable news host. But beneath it, something deeper stirred. In some American living rooms, viewers clapped. "He's telling it straight," one man in Ohio posted. "He's not afraid to say what the elites won't." But others frowned uneasy. An elderly woman in Maryland shook her head, staring at the screen as if she'd just watched a match being lit near dry kindling. "Why do I feel like we've seen this before?" she muttered, reaching for the remote. Meanwhile, half a world away, the clip reached Ouagadougou. Inside a dusty room lit by a single desk lamp, a group of young students crowded around a smartphone. The air was thick with silence as Pete's voice crackled through the tinny speaker. "Strongman cosplay." The students exchanged glances. No one spoke until one of them, a girl named Amina, whispered, "He thinks we're a joke." Within 24 hours, the video had amassed over 3 million views across platforms. The comment section split like a battlefield. Team Hegseth praised his bravery and patriotism. Team Traoré fired back with fire. "You call him a strong man, we call him a shield. The last time the West ignored us, we were colonized. This time we're listening. He fears what he doesn't control." A meme emerged of Traoré's face next to Malcolm X, Che Guevara, and Sankara. The tagline read, "They feared them too." And yet Traoré said nothing. No statement, no interview, no retaliation. The silence only made the noise louder. Cable hosts began circling the story. "Who really is this Ibrahim Traoré?" asked one. "He's too quiet for a man under fire," said another. "Is he planning something?" Even those unfamiliar with Burkina Faso started to notice. Why does a guy in West Africa have Pete so riled up? Why are college students in New York suddenly quoting a soldier from Ouagadougou? Something was happening, something unexpected. The audience could feel it. A pulse, a pressure, a presence building in the background of the world stage. And then came the real question. What would Traoré do next? Because in a world drowning in noise, a man who says nothing often says the most. And in that silence, something was growing: tension, curiosity, and a strange kind of fear. The kind of fear that doesn't shout but waits. Waits for the moment to strike. Waits for the 90 seconds that would change everything. Before the world debated his name in newsrooms and Twitter spaces, before his image was printed on protest banners and t-shirts across Africa, Ibrahim Traoré was just a soldier in the heat and dust of West Africa, unknown, quiet, and watchful. Born in 1988 in the small town of Bondoukoui, Burkina Faso, He came of age in a country still bearing the psychological scars of colonialism. His father was a school teacher, proud, poor, and strict. His mother, a quiet woman of strength, taught him never to speak loudly unless he had something worth saying. As a child, Ibrahim listened more than he talked. He was curious, always observing, always calculating, the kind of boy who sat in the back of the classroom but remembered everything. He entered the University of Ouagadougou to study science, but when the country fell into chaos during the early 2010s, the draw of idealism and the roar of revolution proved stronger than lab notes and lectures. He joined the military in his early 20s not for glory, but because, as he would later say, change needs hands, not just hopes. The army was brutal. It taught him the discipline of silence, the politics of survival. He served in the north in the red zones where jihadist groups had carved fear into the landscape. He lost friends. He buried comrades. He began to see how international powers poured weapons into the region, but never solutions. And the more he fought, the more one name kept haunting him: Thomas Sankara. Burkina Faso's assassinated former leader, the African Che Guevara, the man who dared to say no to France, to the IMF, to corruption. Traoré read Sankara's speeches like scripture. He carried a worn photo of him in his coat pocket. "We must dare to invent the future," Sankara had said. Those words became Ibrahim's quiet obsession. But even then, no one saw him coming. Not in 2022, when the country convulsed in anger under President Paul-Henri Damiba's crumbling regime. Corruption, insecurity, food shortages, the streets boiled with unrest. Soldiers muttered in tents. Civilians lit tires on the roads. Trust was gone. Chaos hung heavy. And then came the night that changed everything. It wasn't a grand speech or a public uprising. It was precise, swift, calculated. On September 30th, 2022, Ibrahim Traoré, just 34 years old, led a faction of junior officers in a bloodless coup that stunned the country and blindsided the world. No one expected him to lead. He was too young, too quiet, too unknown. And yet by dawn, Damiba was gone, and Traoré was at the helm. He stepped in front of the cameras, wearing fatigues, his red beret pulled low. His voice was firm, his words measured. No fanfare, no celebration, just a declaration: "We have taken our responsibility before history." The people responded with thunder. Thousands flooded the streets of Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso. They waved flags, chanted his name, and held up posters of Sankara next to him. Two faces, one dream. Women danced in the roads. Children sang. But not everyone celebrated. Western capitals whispered concern. France frowned. Washington hesitated. Who was this man? How had he moved so swiftly, so silently? Could he be trusted? Was this another populist in camouflage destined to fall into the same traps as those before him? He refused interviews with foreign media. He expelled French military forces. He called for unity with Mali and Niger, creating a new alliance that rattled regional power dynamics. And all the while, he remained quiet, almost enigmatic. To some, that was strength. To others, it was a threat. He governed with few words but firm hands. Roads reopened. Jihadist groups lost ground. He lowered his own salary. He banned ministers from flying first class. His cabinet meetings were austere. No frills, no favors. Still, questions remained. Was this a revolution or a mirage? A rebirth or a rerun? One thing was certain: Ibrahim Traoré had arrived. Not with fanfare, but with purpose. And whether the world liked it or not, he was not leaving quietly. Not anymore. The clip wasn't meant to travel this far. It was designed for an American audience, Fox News viewers, familiar with Pete Hegseth's tone, comfortable with his rhetoric, and mostly unconcerned with the political storms brewing in West Africa. But the internet has a mind of its own. And by the next morning, Pete's fiery takedown of Ibrahim Traoré had slipped its leash. It began with a quiet ripple. Someone clipped the segment, translated the subtitles into French, and posted it on an obscure political forum based in Dakar. Within hours, that ripple had turned into a digital wave, crashing across borders. The video made its way to Telegram channels, in Mali WhatsApp groups, in Abidjan student networks in Ghana. By the time it hit Twitter, X, it had a caption that pulsed with electricity: "American anchor mocks Africa's youngest president." Burkina Faso responds: it exploded. In Accra University, students gathered in front of campus cafes, watching and rewatching the clip with growing disbelief. In Paris, members of the African diaspora flooded Pete's timeline with furious, quote, tweets and biting commentary. In Johannesburg, a radio host dedicated a full hour of her morning show to dissecting the latest Western insult. She ended the segment with a bold prediction: he won't stay silent for long. These are not the days of quiet submission. But still, Traoré said nothing. Not on national television, not through government spokespeople, not even a tweet. He remained as ever silent in the eye of the storm. It was the silence that began to unnerve people, not just his critics, but even his supporters. Some wondered if he had been caught off guard. Others believed he was above responding to what they called imperialist theater. But most saw something else in that silent strategy. A pause that wasn't passive but calculated. It felt like the moment before thunder, like a held breath in a room full of fire. Back in the United States, Pete Hegseth was caught off guard by the blowback. The next evening, he opened his show with a passing reference to the viral reaction, but brushed it off with a smirk. "Apparently, I struck a nerve," he said with a half chuckle. "Let me be clear, I don't apologize for calling out dangerous ideologies, whether they wear a suit or a beret. It was meant to double down, but instead it fanned the flames. A new hashtag began trending, Urias Traoré Challenge. African creators, influencers, and activists posted videos mocking Pete's phrasing, wearing red berets, delivering stoic one-liners, and ending each clip with the line, "A threat to Western interests." The satire was sharp, but beneath the humor, there was pride. Traoré had become more than a president. He was now a symbol, a canvas onto which a generation projected their dreams of dignity, sovereignty, and defiance. And yet he still said nothing. The silence stretched across days, growing heavier, more intentional. Commentators began speculating, was he preparing something? Would he strike back with words or action? Was he silent or listening? By now, the question was no longer whether Pete Hegseth's monologue had hit its target. It was whether he had awakened something far larger than he expected. Something that had been simmering under the surface of a continent for decades. Anger, memory, pride, resistance. And somewhere in the heart of Ouagadougou, far from the studios and tweets and lights, a young president stood before a dusty mirror, adjusting his red beret in silence. Because sometimes the loudest answer begins with nothing at all. Long before he sat beneath the glare of studio lights, Pete Hegseth stood in the dust of Baghdad, rifle in hand, boots sunk into sand, believing with all his heart that he was part of something righteous. He was in his 20s then, a fresh West Point graduate turned infantry officer. Iraq was chaos, but it was his chaos, ordered by his country, sanctioned by his convictions. Democracy, they said, had to be defended abroad so it could thrive at home. He believed it, deeply. The enemy he'd always been told wore beards and burned flags hid in caves or crowded mosques. They hated freedom. They hated America. That was the framework. But frameworks, like foundations, don't always hold forever. Years later, after combat, after the disillusionment of endless deployments, after medals pinned and friends buried, Hegseth returned not just with scars, but with a mission. He would fight on a new front, the front of ideas, of culture, of narratives. And from the leather-backed chair behind the Fox News anchor desk, he swung hard. To him, the battle had always been ideological. Freedom versus tyranny. Capitalism versus control. America versus the world's chaos. That's why he saw himself not just as a commentator, but as a sentinel, a soldier with a microphone. And so when he looked at Ibrahim Traoré, he didn't see nuance. He didn't see Burkina Faso's history or trauma or revolution. He saw a uniform. A young man in military garb, speaking with clenched fists and fiery eyes, throwing verbal daggers at France, at the West, at the very ideals Pete had bled for. That was enough. He squinted at the clips of Traoré speaking in French, standing defiantly before crowds, speaking of sovereignty, of decolonization, of a new Africa unchained. And all Pete could think was, we've seen this movie before. To him, it smelled of Chavez in Venezuela, of Fidel in Havana, of populist bluster dressed as patriotism. It was the same pattern, anti-Western rhetoric, militarized charisma crowds, chanting slogans they barely understood. He didn't need subtitles to feel the temperature of Traoré's speeches. It felt like defiance, and defiance in Pete's eyes was often a prelude to danger. What made it worse was how fast it was spreading. Pete had always believed in American exceptionalism, not arrogance but leadership. A world without America, he believed, was a world led by chaos: Russia, China, Iran. And now Africa, at least parts of it, was beginning to slip away from the American orbit. That's what truly unnerved him. Not just Traoré's words, but the speed with which they echoed across youth movements, student protests, even parts of social media in Europe and the US. Young people sharing clips quoting him, calling for change in their own countries. Pete saw it as a virus, a contagious idea, one that could spread like wildfire if left unchecked. They're not just clapping for him, he told a producer off camera, they're clapping against us. To him, Traoré represented not just a man, but a mirror, one that reflected the deep, growing dissatisfaction many around the world held toward the Western order. And that terrified Pete more than he cared to admit. Because if someone like Traoré, young, unpolished, untested, could gain global influence simply by standing up and saying no to Western power, then what did that say about the state of Western power itself? Was it still leadership if people no longer wanted to follow? And here lay the quiet irony. Pete Hegseth, a proud defender of democracy, was now unnerved by a man whose power came not from election fraud or violence, but from a genuine groundswell of popular support. And while he could criticize Traoré's lack of experience, or his ties to Russia, or his fiery language, there was one thing Pete could not deny: the world was listening. And perhaps more alarmingly, some were nodding. Burkina Faso was once called Upper Volta, a name not born from its rivers or people but imposed by colonial cartographers who carved Africa like meat on a platter. For decades, the country existed not as a nation, but as a dot on a European map, a pawn in France's imperial game. The French did not just extract resources, they extracted identity. Language, law, education, even the currency were redesigned to serve a master thousands of miles away. By the time independence was declared in 1960, the bones of colonization remained embedded deep in the soil, in the government buildings that echoed with foreign tongues, in the school books printed in Paris, in the tricolor flags still waving on embassies and military outposts. But in 1983, a young captain named Thomas Sankara seized power and history trembled. Sankara rode into office like a storm, refusing the imported luxury cars, slashing government salaries, planting millions of trees to fight desertification. He renamed the country from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, the land of upright people. He banned colonial symbols, rejected aid with conditions, and warned against the neo-colonial noose of international debt. Most dangerously, he spoke the truth loudly. He addressed the UN in a cheap suit, refusing translators, calling out imperial hypocrisy to the faces of those who wrote the world's rules. He refused to let France decide Burkina Faso's fate, and in doing so he lit a fire in the hearts of millions, not just in his country, but across the continent. But fire attracts enemies. On October 15, 1987, Sankara was assassinated in a coup many believed was orchestrated with foreign complicity. His body was buried hastily, unmarked. His name was erased from official records. His visions, some hoped, would fade into myth, but it didn't. It smoldered quietly in the memories of villagers, in the hearts of students, in the whispers of grandparents who remembered a brief moment when they felt truly free. In Burkina Faso, Sankara became more than a man. He became a ghost, a martyr, a symbol of what could have been. And then decades later, another soldier rose, Ibrahim Traoré. He didn't declare himself Sankara's heir. He didn't need to. The people did it for him. From the moment he appeared on television in his red beret, standing straight-backed and unapologetic, the comparisons began. The imagery was too familiar, the timing too poetic. A young officer fueled by patriotism, challenging both internal decay and external control. In the streets, they held up faded photos of Sankara beside fresh images of Traoré, like a torch being passed across time. He picks up the sword where Sankara fell, one protester said, tears in her eyes. But to pick up that sword was to invite the same enemies. France still had military bases in the region. Its economic presence remained embedded through the CFA franc, a colonial currency still used by 14 African countries. Though dressed in diplomacy, the French relationship with Burkina Faso was fraught with tension, quiet contempt, and the subtle air of ownership. Many in Paris saw Traoré's rhetoric as dangerous. And dangerous men, history had shown, often didn't last long. Yet Traoré marched on. He cut ties with France's military, ordered foreign troops to leave, and began forging bonds with other African nations seeking a break from dependency. He re-centered Burkina Faso, not just geographically, but spiritually. He was not trying to become Sankara. He was becoming what Sankara never had the chance to be, a continuation. But ghosts are not easily laid to rest. In every move Traoré made, the shadow of Sankara followed. Every speech he gave echoed with the past. Every step forward stirred dust that had long settled. And the question, silent but urgent, lingered in the minds of his people. Could this time be different, or would history once again eat its young? In Manhattan, the lights never dimmed. Inside the Fox News studio, Pete Hegseth sat behind a polished glass desk, flipping through cue cards with practiced ease. The screen beside him glowed with updated headlines. Burkina Faso's military leader, defiant in face of Western scrutiny. His producers moved like stagehands, adjusting mics, tweaking angles, coordinating the visuals to match the narrative. Pete was composed, but there was a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. He leaned into the mirror in the green room, straightened his tie, then paused, staring at his own reflection. It was a familiar ritual, one born on battlefield mornings and carried into the newsroom. Steel yourself. Speak strong. Show no cracks. "We go in 30, someone called out. He nodded. In his mind, he ran through talking points. Democracy, instability, anti-Western sentiment. He had statistics. He had names. He had a voice that millions trusted. But what he didn't have, what nagged at him more than he admitted, was clarity about why this particular story lingered. Half a world away, Ibrahim Traoré walked along a dirt road surrounded by fields the color of rust. The village was remote. No media, no podiums, no prepared remarks. He wore simple fatigues, sleeves rolled, red beret tucked under his arm. Children trailed behind him barefoot and curious, giggling whenever he looked their way. He wasn't here to speak. He was here to listen. He stopped beneath a baobab tree where elders sat on carved stools, their faces lined by sun and time. One woman, her voice like gravel, spoke of food, prices of medicine, shortages of fear. A man described a raid by extremists 2 villages over. Another asked why French aid had dried up and whether Burkina Faso was truly strong enough to go it alone. Traoré said little. He nodded, took notes, asked brief questions. Silence for him was not absence. It was presence. Behind his eyes, a different kind of war raged, not of bullets or broadcasts, but of meaning. He was not preparing for an interview or a speech, but for something heavier, responsibility. When he spoke next, whenever that would be, it could not be just reaction. It had to be truth, measured, precise, and worthy of those who had nothing left to gamble but hope. Back in New York, Pete's segment began. He spoke with conviction, polished, articulate, powerful. Clips played of Traoré surrounded by soldiers, flags waving, crowds roaring. Pete's voice overlaid it all like thunder. These leaders play to their people, but they provoke chaos abroad. When they reject the West, they aren't choosing independence, they're choosing instability. The broadcast ran seamlessly. No stutters, no doubts on the surface. But off camera, one of his assistants hesitated, staring at a small screen showing live comments flooding in. For the first time, the replies were split, some cheering, others questioning. A few simply said, "Have you ever been there?" The divide wasn't just between 2 continents. It was between 2 realities. One man prepared his words in a studio wrapped in glass and digital certainty. The other in a village wrapped in dust, uncertainty, and memory. And somewhere suspended between satellite signals and silent fields, the world waited for the next move. Not because of who they were, but because of what they represented. 2 visions, 2 ideologies, 2 truths. Because when you carry history on your back, every word becomes a weapon. And the next word could be the one that breaks the silence. The heat pressed down like a hand from the sky. It was the kind of mid-morning sun that baked the earth into stone and left no shade untouched. In the outskirts of Ouagadougou, on the edge of a military compound lined with scorched grass and rusted fencing, a simple podium stood beneath a faded canopy. There were no flags flapping in the breeze. There was no breeze, no media vans, no elaborate lighting. Just a single camera fixed unblinking and already recording. And then he stepped into frame. Ibrahim Traoré wore his signature fatigues, the red beret snug against his temple, eyes steady under furrowed brows. Behind him, a line of soldiers stood silent, not for ceremony, but as guardians of the moment. A dusty wind curled through the dry air, carrying the scent of earth and iron. He cleared his throat, then began. To those watching from abroad, those who question us, insult us, define us without knowing our names. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Each syllable was delivered with the control of a man who understood the weight of stillness. I have heard what has been said, the lectures, the warnings, the mockery dressed as concern. Let me be clear, Africa will no longer kneel, not before bombs, not before banks, and certainly not before microphones. The words sliced through the silence, short, clean, final. The camera didn't zoom. There was no dramatic soundtrack, but those 90 seconds, just 90, would become the most replayed, translated, and dissected political statement in Africa since the death of Nelson Mandela. Traoré went on, voice unwavering. We are not seeking enemies. We are not seeking applause. We are seeking our future. We will decide it with our people, not with consultants flown in from think tanks, not with soldiers who don't speak our language, and not with men on television who have never walked among our villages, never buried our dead, never heard a mother beg for rice in a market torn by war. He paused, eyes narrowing just slightly. We are tired of being told that independence is dangerous, that dignity is radical, that sovereignty is instability. If that is how you see us, then you do not see us at all. There was no anger in his tone, only certainty. And that perhaps was more unsettling than rage. His final sentence hung in the air like a verdict. We do not belong to you. We belong to ourselves. Then he stepped away. No follow-up questions, no hashtags, no applause. The clip ended as abruptly as it had begun, with Traoré turning from the camera boots, crunching against the dry ground, disappearing into the light without looking back. Within minutes, the video began to spread. It was posted first on a government channel with little fanfare. Then came the retweets, the reactions, the sudden storm. TikTok flooded with reaction clips, young Africans nodding silently, some crying, others pounding fists into their chests. The line "Africa will no longer kneel" became a banner, a tattoo, a protest chant, a ringtone. It was etched across walls and Accra sprayed onto posters in Bamako, chanted through megaphones in Johannesburg. Western media scrambled to keep up. CNN analysts dissected the rhetoric. French anchors stiffened as the clip played on evening news. Pete Hegseth's name wasn't mentioned, not even once, but the implication was unmistakable. This was not a reply. This was a reckoning. And while cable hosts debated its meaning in one village near the Malian border, an elderly man watched the video on a borrowed smartphone. When it ended, he handed the phone back and whispered to no one in particular, "That was not a speech. That was a beginning." Traoré had not roared. He had not provoked. But he had done something far more dangerous. He had told the truth. And now the world would have to decide what to do with it. It began as a ripple, just one video, 90 seconds. A man in fatigues under the sun, speaking not with rage, but with fire forged in restraint. And yet within 12 hours, that ripple had become a wave, one crashing into timelines, comment sections, and news feeds from Lagos to Los Angeles. The tag appeared first on Twitter, Traoré90. Then it hit Instagram Reels, Facebook groups, Telegram channels, WhatsApp broadcasts. Clips flooded every corner of the digital world, not just reposted, but remixed, translated, animated, and amplified. In Nairobi, graffiti artists painted his silhouette across concrete walls beneath the quote, "We do not belong to you. We belong to ourselves." In Dakar, student leaders projected the video onto the side of the university library, followed by cheers that echoed into midnight. In London, Black Lives Matter organizers shared the speech captioned, "From Burkina Faso to the Bronx, the resistance has no borders." Within 48 hours, Traoré90 had been used over 3 million times. But it wasn't just Africans or the diaspora who felt the tremor. In Brooklyn, a podcast host paused mid-recording after playing the clip. Her voice cracked as she said, "I don't know this man, but I felt every word like it was for me." In Berlin, a university professor replaced his lecture on post-colonial economics with a full breakdown of the speech. This, he told his students, is what happens when history speaks through the living. Progressives in the West, many long disillusioned with foreign policy double standards, saw something raw and righteous in Traoré's defiance. Editorial columns emerged with titles like "The Leader the West Forgot to Make Room For" and "Traoré and the Voice of a Decolonized Generation." They called him principled, courageous, necessary, but not everyone agreed. On American talk, radio hosts railed against what they called neo-Marxist cosplay. One conservative columnist tweeted, "Traoré is no hero. He's a populist in uniform with a Soviet-era script." Her post was retweeted by Pete Hegseth, who added simply, "Exactly." Cable news divided like clockwork. MSNBC called the speech the cry of the global South. Fox News labeled it anti-Western rhetoric dressed in revolutionary nostalgia. The comment sections were war zones. He's arrogant. He's brave. He's just another dictator in the making. He said what needed to be said. One thread in particular began to trend. A Nigerian-born software engineer in Seattle wrote, "What scares them isn't his uniform. It's that he didn't ask for permission." That post reached nearly 10 million views in a day. The split wasn't just political, it was generational, cultural, emotional. For some, Traoré was the embodiment of dangerous populism. For others, he was the first political figure in decades who felt real, unpolished, unscripted, and unafraid. A handful of journalists began digging into his past, his military record, his salary, his policies. Some praised his refusal to enrich himself or decorate his office with imported leather chairs. Others warned that charisma without checks is just a fuse waiting to be lit. But while the world argued, one truth emerged with startling clarity: people were watching. The old world of diplomatic speeches and polite policy roundtables had been bypassed by a man who spoke plain from the earth. And that authenticity, raw, imperfect, undiplomatic, was his weapon. Across Africa, Traoré 90 wasn't just a clip anymore. It was a statement, a mood, a banner under which people gathered not to glorify a man, but to reclaim a voice. And as the views climbed past 50 million, one American reporter finally asked the question that had been simmering beneath the surface all along. What if this isn't about Traoré at all? What if this is about everything he refuses to kneel to? The studio lights were as blinding as ever, but for the first time, Pete Hegseth felt the heat not from the bulbs overhead, but from the chair beneath him. There was a strange weight to the air, the kind of heaviness that doesn't announce itself, but lingers invisible and undeniable, like the pause before a storm. It was Thursday night, prime time. He sat upright in his chair, expression composed, tie knotted perfectly. But behind the camera, his producer gave him a longer than usual look. Something unspoken passed between them. This wasn't just another segment. This was a moment. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Backlash over Africa comments, fair criticism, or global overreaction." The anchor sitting across from him, a fellow Fox host, didn't ease into it. She dove straight in. "Pete, your comments last week about Ibrahim Traoré, they've gone viral, millions of views, major blowback. Some are saying your tone was dismissive. Others are calling it flat-out disrespectful. Do you regret the way you said it?" For a second, just one, but long enough, he hesitated. It wasn't much. A flicker in the eye, a momentary purse of the lips, a pause that in television feels like a lifetime. And in that split second, the crack appeared. "Look," he finally said, voice steady but tighter than usual, "I stand by what I said. I believe in calling things as they are. My concern is with growing anti-Western sentiment masquerading as independence. That's not new and it's not harmless. It was a carefully crafted response. Not an apology, not a retraction, just enough pushback to reassert control. But something about it didn't land. The energy in the room shifted. The tone felt rehearsed, defensive. Viewers noticed. The internet did what it does best: rewind, replay, dissect. That single pause, those 3 silent seconds before he spoke, became a meme within hours. Screenshots of his face mid-hesitation filled Twitter feeds. Captions ranged from mockery to rage. He blinked. The empire stutters. He didn't expect the world to take the other side. It wasn't just that Traoré had spoken, it was that people had listened loudly, globally defiantly, and now Hegseth found himself in an unfamiliar position, not as the narrator, but as the story. More troubling for him was the slow shift among his own audience. Messages began trickling in, not from the usual opposition, but from viewers who had long trusted him. "I love your work, Pete, but maybe this one missed the mark. We should be listening, not just lecturing. You always talk about fighting for freedom. What if that's what he's doing too?" He read each message, jaw tightening. He'd built a career on confidence, on being unflinching, on standing firm, no matter the backlash. But this was different. This wasn't just political disagreement. This was identity, ideology, and perception fracturing at the edges. Behind closed doors, executives whispered. Public relations teams drafted statements just in case. Producers debated whether to bring Traoré's name up again or let the storm die naturally. But the numbers said it wasn't dying. It was accelerating. And in the quiet of his office later that night, with his phone still buzzing and comment threads multiplying by the minute, Pete sat alone, the glow of the screen casting shadows across his face. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure he was winning. The shift wasn't announced. It crept in subtle at first, almost imperceptible. But for those who understood how media worked, the signs were clear. The tone was changing. On Fox News, the outrage that once crackled with certainty around Ibrahim Traoré began to dull around the edges. Analysts who previously referred to him as a militant demagogue now started adding qualifiers. "There's nuance here. He's young, yes, but clearly charismatic. It's complicated." It was still criticism, but slower, softer, less absolute. Pete Hegseth's name quietly disappeared from Traoré-related headlines. A newer host took over the Africa segment, one known less for fire and more for facts. The network hadn't reversed its stance, it had simply stepped sideways, adjusting the lens, blurring the sharpness just enough to create distance. The legal team had advised caution, the social team had shown the metrics. The backlash wasn't just online, it was international, sustained and growing. But while American outlets recalibrated, French media accelerated. In Paris, the headlines came fast and hot. Traoré's hidden alliances with Russian mercenaries, Burkina Faso, at risk, an autocrat in the making, populism in military camouflage. Is Traoré Burkina Faso's Chavez? Even the photographs began to shift. Gone were the neutral shots of him at podiums. Instead, French papers published images of him flanked by soldiers, shadowed by flags, often cropped to darken his eyes or sharpen the tension in his jaw. One editorial referred to him as a boy in a man's war. But it wasn't just the headlines, it was the orchestration behind them. Op-eds circulated through multiple publications with eerily similar language. Political analysts suddenly appeared on evening panels echoing concerns about regional destabilization, anti-Western radicalization, and a troubling pattern of rhetoric. French think tanks released reports within days-long data-heavy pieces questioning Traoré's military credentials, his economic decisions, and his diplomatic ties. The message was clear: he might talk revolution, but he walks toward recklessness. And yet across the African continent, a very different storm was gathering. In Accra, a news anchor stared straight into the camera and said, "They fear him because they can't control him." In Lagos, one of the largest independent radio stations ran a 5-part series titled "Why the West Panics When Africa Thinks for Itself." Social media feeds pulsed with energy. African journalists, bloggers, influencers, and intellectuals fought back against the narrative tsunami. They pointed out the double standards, how Traoré was labeled a populist, while Western leaders who stirred nationalist sentiment at home were called patriots. They reminded the world of the past, of coups orchestrated by foreign intelligence, of leaders assassinated after refusing Western loans, of decades of debt diplomacy wrapped in foreign aid. "They call him dangerous," one commentator in Nairobi tweeted, "because he chose to walk away from their leash." Even mainstream African newspapers ran editorials defending Traoré, not as a flawless leader, but as a necessary disruption. A mirror held up to a global order that too often pretended stability and justice were the same thing. And still, Traoré remained silent. He made no effort to deny the stories coming out of France. No rebuttal interviews, no angry declarations. He traveled quietly to Mali, met with regional allies, reviewed infrastructure projects. The absence of reaction only amplified the speculation. Some saw it as strategic brilliance. Others whispered about pressure building behind closed doors. But one thing was now clear to the world. This was no longer just about one man. It was about who got to shape the story, who got to decide what leadership looked like, who got to define which revolutions were acceptable and which were not. And as media machines on both sides spun faster, churning out narratives like bullets, the global audience leaned in spellbound, trying to decipher the truth in the noise. But somewhere in the middle of it all, in a rural town where the internet still lagged and TV signals flickered, an old woman folded a newspaper and said quietly to her granddaughter, "When the wolves howl this loudly, the lion must be close." On Twitter, now rebranded as X, the battlefield wasn't drawn with borders, but with algorithms. The battleground wasn't fought with soldiers, but with symbols, screenshots, sarcasm, and 280 characters of sharpened truth or weaponized distortion. And at the center of it all was Ibrahim Traoré. His name wasn't just trending in West Africa anymore. It was climbing hashtags in Sao Paulo, Jakarta, Manila, and even parts of Eastern Europe. The clip, those 90 seconds, had been subtitled into Portuguese, Bahasa Indonesia, Spanish, Hindi, Swahili. His words had become an echo chamber of defiance, and the internet was doing what it always does when it finds something that feels real. It exploded. Traoré 90 had mutated into something larger, an online movement, where digital avatars waved Pan-African flags and profile bios read, "Africa will no longer kneel." But it wasn't just Africans. Young progressives in the global South latched onto his story as proof that their voices mattered too, that rejecting Western dominance wasn't rebellion, it was realism. A young teacher in Rio de Janeiro tweeted, "He speaks for Burkina Faso. But I heard Brazil in every word." A student in Bangkok wrote, "They called him a threat. That means he's onto something." These weren't coordinated campaigns. They were spontaneous expressions, fragments of global exhaustion posted from phones that had never touched African soil, but recognized the tone of colonial condescension when they heard it. But as the hashtags rose, so did the heat. Western pundits, politicians, academics, retired diplomats began firing back. They questioned his democratic legitimacy. They pointed to Burkina Faso's instability. They cited think tank reports and historical precedent. Traoré, they insisted, was dangerously charismatic, untested, backed by foreign interests, an opportunist in revolutionary costume. The responses were swift and brutal. "You've been bombing democracies for decades," one Kenyan activist replied. "You just don't like it when we write our own stories." Sankara 2.0. Get used to it. A post by a South African rapper went viral. America calls it freedom when it drops missiles. But when we speak without permission, it's extremism. The tweet hit 5 million views in a day. Journalists posted screenshots of Western newspapers referring to Traoré as a populist, then compared them to headlines describing right-wing European leaders with far softer language. The contrast lit a fire in digital spaces already drenched in gasoline. Traoré's supporters weren't just defending him, they were challenging the entire lens through which the global North viewed the global South. Memes followed. Traoré's beret was photoshopped onto historical revolutionaries, video game heroes, comic book icons. One popular post showed him alongside Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, Che Guevara, and even Malcolm X, with a caption that read, "They fear those who can't be bought." But beneath the humor pulsed a growing seriousness. Young Africans, Latinos, Southeast Asians, and even segments of Black American Twitter were no longer laughing. They were organizing, debating, reading up. A surge in Google searches for Burkina Faso history and Sankara quotes spiked across the US and Europe. Discord servers held late-night discussions. YouTube creators began analyzing the speech frame by frame. A tweet from a Ghanaian tech worker summed up the moment the colonizers used ships and flags. Now it's headlines and hashtags. But we're not asleep anymore. Even bots joined the war. Pro-Western accounts, some suspected to be government-linked, flooded threads with counter-arguments, breaking news links, claims of instability in Burkina Faso. But it was too late to contain the momentum. The digital terrain had shifted. The war of words was no longer just about Traoré. It was about whose voice got to define justice, whose pain was considered legitimate, whose revolution was deemed acceptable. And in that noisy, infinite scroll, something once unimaginable had occurred. A soldier from a landlocked African country without a single aircraft carrier or tech empire had through silence, then speech hijacked the world's conversation. The room was hot not from the sun outside but from the friction of too many opinions in too small a space. Traoré sat at the head of a narrow wooden table in a plain government building in central Ouagadougou. No gold trim, no polished mahogany, just concrete walls, a ceiling fan, spinning too slow to matter, and a group of tense advisors urging him to speak again. The pressure was mounting. Western media had doubled down. Think tanks, embassies, even neighboring heads of state were quietly waiting for what he would say next. His 90-second clip had ignited something global, but now his silence was being interpreted by some as weakness, by others as indecision. He knew this room well. It was not where speeches were written, it was where messages were measured. And right now the scales were heavy. His defense minister, a former colonel with a steel-trimmed voice, leaned forward. A longer address would show leadership, he said. Clarity, strategy. We can frame it as part 2. You can speak about vision, about plans. You've got the world's ears. Use them. Others nodded. One aide held up talking points. Another proposed a press conference. A third recommended calling out France directly. Why wait for their narrative, she asked. Dominate the story. Traoré listened, arms folded. He didn't raise his voice. When he finally spoke, it was quiet, controlled. One punch is stronger than 10 slaps. The room fell still. He wasn't being poetic. He meant it. The first speech had landed like a hammer because it was distilled, unflinching, unapologetically clear. Every word had weight because there were so few of them. Now to elaborate, to explain, to soften or reframe, it would feel like retreat, like translation for the benefit of those who hadn't understood the first time. If they need me to say more, he added, then they weren't listening. He stood, the conversation finished. The aides remained seated, exchanging looks that mixed frustration with respect. None of them dared to push further. They'd seen this resolve before, years ago, when he was still just a field officer, refusing to abandon a post others had called lost. He was the same man now, only the battlefield had changed. Miles away in the village where he was born, his mother knelt on a mat made of woven reeds beneath the same clay roof she had lived under since marriage. She was not watching the news. She didn't follow Twitter, but she knew enough to feel the tension in the wind, to see it in the faces of the visitors who came bearing gifts and questions. She prayed in silence, lips moving gently, hands folded on her lap. She prayed not for power, not for victory, not even for protection. She prayed for steadiness, for her son to hold to the values she had braided into him like she once braided his hair, firm, tight, unshifting. She prayed that the noise would not tempt him to speak more than needed, that he would hear what the world shouting tried to drown out the truth inside him. Because long before he was a president, before he wore a uniform or stood behind microphones, he was just a boy sitting at her feet, watching her grind, millet by hand, learning patience by watching the slow rhythm of survival. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré stepped out onto a balcony, looked out at the horizon, thick with heat and haze, and exhaled. The world wanted more words. But he knew some battles are not won by louder voices, but by quieter resolve. And sometimes the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield is not a speech, but a silence that refuses to bend. The echo of Traoré's 90-second speech had long escaped the borders of Burkina Faso, rippling outward like a sonic boom. It reached marble corridors and lecture halls, wooden podiums, and panel stages. And by now it wasn't just trending online. It was climbing the agendas of world institutions, spurring conversations that had gone unspoken for far too long. At the United Nations headquarters in New York, a special session on health security was underway. It should have been routine. Policy statements, aid figures, vague calls for stability. But something was different this time. Delegates from Senegal, Mali, and Ghana referenced the winds of change sweeping across the region. A few dared to name Traoré, directly though carefully. Too much enthusiasm might be seen as rebellion. Too little might be interpreted as complicity. The French representative urged caution, called for respect for institutional continuity, and warned of regional actors steering away from constructive diplomacy. The room listened politely, but a subtle shift in posture, eyes narrowing, heads tilting, revealed something more doubt. Outside the building, protesters gathered behind barricades holding signs in multiple languages. Let Africa breathe. We remember Sankara. Decolonization is not a crime. The story was no longer niche, it had become global. On university campuses across the United States, debates flared like brush fires. In classrooms and auditoriums, from Howard to Harvard, from Berkeley to Georgetown, Traoré's name became a focal point in discussions on empire resistance and rhetoric. Professors adjusted syllabi to include analysis of his speech. Students played the video during political theory presentations. Debate teams held mock UN summits where Traoré's strategy was dissected as both brilliance and brinkmanship. In one packed lecture hall at NYU, a visiting historian, tall, gray-bearded, softly spoken, stood before a sea of restless, curious minds and offered a single line that quieted the room. This is not about two men. It's about 2 centuries of ideology. Silence fell. Pen stopped scribbling. He elaborated, not in a dramatic monologue, but with the quiet gravity of a man who had watched history repeat itself too many times. You see Hegseth on one side, American soldier, media man, nationalist patriot. You see Traoré on the other, young, defiant soldier statesman from a land that was once colonized. But these men are not just themselves. They are archetypes. One represents the legacy of control, the other the hunger for self-determination. What we're witnessing isn't a clash of personalities. It's the delayed confrontation of empire and identity. And outside the classroom, the nation wrestled with its own response. Cable hosts sharpened their angles. Liberal outlets praised Traoré's radical clarity. Conservative columnists called the coverage media fawning over a glorified junta. Pete Hegseth, now mentioned less frequently by name, had become a sort of cipher depending on the viewer, either a proud American who stood firm against destabilization or a symbol of Western arrogance who underestimated the world's growing refusal to be lectured. Every image of him from his now infamous Fox segment was recontextualized. Meme pages paired his expression with phrases like, "when you realize the script doesn't work anymore." Political satire shows reenacted his pause before answering the regret question, turning it into a running bit called the global oops. Even comedy had chosen a side. But the divide wasn't just cultural, it was generational. Older audiences were more cautious, skeptical of Traoré's methods. Younger ones were captivated. They weren't necessarily pro-Traoré, they were anti-silencing, anti-condescension. They didn't need perfection. They needed honesty, rawness, someone unafraid to speak in complete sentences without running it through a media filter. Across the Atlantic in Burkina Faso, none of this was lost on Traoré. Though he didn't tweet, didn't go on air, didn't clarify, he read. His aides showed him headlines, summaries, student essays. He nodded quietly, not with ego, but with awareness. He knew what was happening. He was becoming a vessel, a placeholder for frustrations that stretched beyond his borders, beyond even the continent, a spark lighting up old fuel. And though he hadn't asked for this war of meanings, he understood the weight of it. Because when the world watches, every step becomes a statement, every silence becomes a strategy, and every echo becomes harder to silence. The echo of Traoré's 90-second speech had long escaped the borders of Burkina Faso, rippling outward like a sonic boom. It reached marble corridors and lecture halls, wooden podiums and panel stages. And by now it wasn't just trending online. It was climbing the agendas of world institutions, spurring conversations that had gone unspoken for far too long. At the United Nations headquarters in New York, a special session on Sahel security was underway. It should have been routine. Policy statements, aid figures, vague calls for stability. But something was different this time. Delegates from Senegal, Mali, and Ghana referenced the winds of change sweeping across the region. A few dared to name Traoré directly, though carefully. Too much enthusiasm might be seen as rebellion. Too little might be interpreted as complicity. The French representative urged caution, called for respect for institutional continuity, and warned of regional actors steering away from constructive diplomacy. The room listened politely, but a subtle shift in posture, eyes narrowing, heads tilting, revealed something more: doubt. Outside the building, protesters gathered behind barricades holding signs in multiple languages. Let Africa breathe. We remember Sankara. Decolonization is not a crime. The story was no longer niche. It had become global. On university campuses across the United States, debates flared like brush fires. In classrooms and auditoriums from Howard to Harvard, from Berkeley to Georgetown, Traoré's name became a focal point in discussions on empire resistance and rhetoric. Professors adjusted syllabi to include analysis of his speech. Students played the video during political theory presentations. Debate teams held mock UN summits where Traoré's strategy was dissected as both brilliance and brinkmanship. In one packed lecture hall at NYU, a visiting historian, tall, gray-bearded, softly spoken, stood before a sea of restless, curious minds and offered a single line that quieted the room. "This is not about two men. It's about 2 centuries of ideology." Silence fell. Pen stopped scribbling. He elaborated, not in a dramatic monologue, but with the quiet gravity of a man who had watched history repeat itself too many times. "You see Hegseth on one side, American soldier, media man, nationalist patriot. You see Traoré on the other, young defiant soldier statesman from a land that was once colonized. But these men are not just themselves. They are archetypes. One represents the legacy of control, the other the hunger for self-determination. What we're witnessing isn't a clash of personalities. It's the delayed confrontation of empire and identity. And outside the classroom, the nation wrestled with its own response. Cable hosts sharpened their angles. Liberal outlets praised Traoré's radical clarity. Conservative columnists called the coverage media fawning over a glorified junta. Pete Hegseth, now mentioned less frequently by name, had become a sort of cipher, depending on the viewer, either a proud American who stood firm against destabilization or a symbol of Western arrogance who underestimated the world's growing refusal to be lectured. Every image of him from his now infamous Fox segment was recontextualized. Meme pages paired his expression with phrases like, "when you realize the script doesn't work anymore." Political satire shows reenacted his pause before answering the regret question, turning it into a running bit called the global oops. Even comedy had chosen a side. But the divide wasn't just cultural, it was generational. Older audiences were more cautious, skeptical of Traoré's methods. Younger ones were captivated. They weren't necessarily pro-Traoré, they were anti-silencing, anti-condescension. They didn't need perfection. They needed honesty, rawness, someone unafraid to speak in complete sentences without running it through a media filter. Across the Atlantic in Burkina Faso, none of this was lost on Traoré. Though he didn't tweet, didn't go on air, didn't clarify he read. His aides showed him headlines, summaries, student essays. He nodded quietly, not with ego, but with awareness. He knew what was happening. He was becoming a vessel, a placeholder for frustrations that stretched beyond his borders, beyond even the continent, a spark lighting up old fuel. And though he hadn't asked for this war of meanings, he understood the weight of it. Because when the world watches, every step becomes a statement, every silence becomes a strategy, and every echo becomes harder to silence. In Paris, the halls of power pulsed with quiet urgency. Behind closed doors in the Quai d'Orsay, France's foreign ministry convened yet another emergency briefing. The optics were getting worse. The silence from Ouagadougou had become louder than any declaration. Traoré's refusal to escalate made it harder to paint him as unstable, yet his influence was growing. His restraint, maddening in its discipline, had turned him from a provincial figure into a global conversation. So the strategy shifted. Pressure was redirected toward ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. French diplomats, cloaked in polite concern, pushed member states to act to isolate Burkina Faso diplomatically, to threaten sanctions, to frame Traoré as a rogue actor undermining regional cohesion. Meetings were held in Abuja, statements were drafted with careful vagueness, and envoys were sent to test the resolve of neighboring governments. Behind the curtain, France whispered one word over and over: containment. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States stood still, watchful, calculating. No bold statements, no direct condemnation. Just a series of quiet cables, internal memos, and low-level briefings. The State Department was wary. They'd seen what overt pressure could do. It could backfire, elevate, radicalize. And besides, Traoré hadn't declared war. He hadn't nationalized foreign assets. He hadn't even insulted the West by name. He had simply refused to kneel. So Washington waited, eyes on the ground, ears tuned to the rhythm of the people. And in Burkina Faso, that rhythm was changing. It started with scattered chants in the capital, small groups, mostly youth gathering with homemade signs and cell phones. Then came the unions, the market vendors, the students. Soon the streets of Ouagadougou were filled with bodies, tens of thousands, not in protest but in assertion, a sea of color dust and noise swelling into the air like a thundercloud. No more chains, the chant spread like wildfire. It echoed through alleyways and rose above rooftops. It was not directed at any single nation, it was directed at a system, one that had existed for generations dressed in treaties, loans, and language about stability. In Bobo Dioulasso, farmers left their fields to join a human chain that stretched for miles. In the northern provinces, entire villages marched barefoot into town centers carrying flags they had sewn by hand. Some carried photographs of Sankara, others wore shirts with Traoré's face beside the words, "This time we remember." There were no riots, no fire, just voice, just movement, just the weight of collective memory rising to the surface. Inside the presidential compound, Traoré watched from a shaded balcony, arms crossed, face unreadable. He did not wave. He did not smile. He stood as still as a statue, bearing witness to the thing his father never lived to see: a people unafraid. His aides reported ECOWAS's deliberations. France's tone was hardening. Regional pressure was building. The isolation was real, but so was the momentum. And somewhere in that quiet, a realization took root, not just in Burkina Faso, but across the region. Something was shifting. A boundary was being redrawn, not by diplomats, not by armies, but by the people themselves. This was no longer diplomacy, no longer protest. It was something else entirely. It was the edge of something monumental. It was the moment before the break, the breath before the leap, and all the world could do now was hold its own breath and wait. The room was colder than expected, blanketed in over-conditioned air and the heavy silence of anticipation. Marble columns framed the hall, high ceilings echoed even the softest cough, and a ring of translation booths lined the rear wall like watchful eyes. This was the annual Africa Regional Leadership Summit, a meeting of heads of state, economists, security advisors, and diplomats. The agenda officially was stability. Unofficially, it was him. Ibrahim Traoré's name was not printed on the conference banner, but his presence lingered in every whispered conversation, in every hallway glance, in every cautiously worded panel remark. His 90-second video had not just reached the summit, it had reshaped its center of gravity. He arrived without spectacle, flanked only by two aides. No entourage, no red carpet. He wore the same military fatigues he always did, his red beret tucked into one shoulder strap. The other leaders had come in tailored suits and silk ties, the usual elegance of state. But when Traoré entered the chamber, the room straightened as if it had been holding its breath. His name was called. He stepped forward to the podium with the measured pace of someone who understood that every footfall now echoed beyond the room. He adjusted the microphone. He looked out, not up, and let the silence stretch, not for drama, but to claim the space. His words came not with force, but with clarity, his voice as calm as it was commanding. "I stand here not to divide us from the world," he began, "but to remind us that we are part of it on our own terms." There were no notes in front of him, no teleprompter, just the conviction of a man who had been preparing his entire life to say this aloud. Burkina Faso is not against the West. We are not against development partnership or cooperation, but we are against control disguised as generosity. We are against influence bought with conditions. We are against a system that asks us to smile while being swallowed. He paused. The translators caught up. Heads nodded slowly across the table. "We do not hate the West," he said, eyes scanning the room. "We just love our future more." That sentence landed like a thunderclap, quiet but seismic. Some delegates shifted in their seats, unsure whether to clap. Others looked down at their notes, their eyes betraying a recognition they didn't want to voice. But from the back rows, from the younger diplomats, the aides, the regional observers, the applause started. Hesitant at first, then swelling. A standing ovation. Not from every leader, not all at once, but enough to break the rhythm of silence that had governed the summit for decades. Traoré didn't smile. He simply nodded, stepped down, and returned to his seat. He had not raised his voice. He had not called out Pete Hegseth, France, or any specific critic. But the shadow of that tension hovered over every sentence, felt but unnamed. His words had moved beyond rebuttal. They were not answers, they were declarations. As the applause faded, a sense settled over the room. This was not a phase, not a social media moment. It was a shift in posture, a recalibration of what African leadership could look like and who it could speak for. Later that evening, a Kenyan delegate was overheard saying to a colleague, "That wasn't a speech, that was a line in the sand." And from that moment forward, it became harder, dangerously harder, for anyone anywhere to pretend that Ibrahim Traoré was just another face in a uniform. It happened gradually, like steam dissipating from a window pane. One by one, American news anchors began softening their words, not reversing their narratives, but rephrasing them, recalibrating their stance as if testing the water before stepping in. On a Sunday morning panel show, a well-known CNN anchor, one who had previously called Traoré an unpredictable nationalist, shifted her tone just slightly. Maybe, she said carefully, we've been too quick to box him in. Maybe what we're witnessing is a generational transition in African leadership, one that doesn't mirror the West but doesn't automatically oppose it either. The panel murmured in agreement. Not full-throated support, just enough acknowledgement to avoid being on the wrong side of a changing narrative. In op-ed pages, the change was more pronounced. The Atlantic ran a headline, "The man the West tried to ignore, maybe the voice Africa needed." The Washington Post published a column by a Sierra Leonean American scholar titled, "We Told You Who Sankara Was. Will you listen this time?" Across the landscape, the story had shifted from warning to wonder, from suspicion to curiosity. The kind of soft pivot only media institutions know how to execute, firm enough to maintain dignity, gentle enough to avoid admitting they were wrong. And then there was Pete Hegseth. He had been quiet for weeks, not absent, but noticeably subdued. His usual segments carried on border policy, education reform, military strength, but Traoré's name hadn't crossed his lips. Until now. It was Friday night. The screen went dark, then brightened with the familiar studio backdrop. Pete sat alone, no guests, just a direct-to-camera monologue. His jaw was tight, his suit crisp, his posture immaculate. "Let me speak plainly," he began, the lights catching the edge of his wedding band as he tapped his fingers against the desk. "I still believe in American leadership. I still believe in our values, our strength, our role in the world. But leadership also means knowing when the world doesn't move at your command." He paused longer than expected. This Traoré, this young leader from Burkina Faso, he's made headlines. He's made waves. And whether you agree with him or not, you can't deny what's happening. He's captured the imagination of people far beyond his borders. That means something. He didn't call him a hero, but he didn't call him dangerous either. We may not see eye to eye, but I respect anyone who carries the weight of their people with discipline. And I hope for their sake and ours that he knows what to do with it. It was the closest he had come to concession. The monologue ended. The camera panned wide. There was a live audience in the studio that night, and as Pete sat back, the applause came. But it wasn't raucous. It wasn't electric. It was hesitant, polite, thoughtful. Some viewers nodded, others looked confused. A few simply turned off the television and sat in silence. Because something was shifting, not just in how the world saw Traoré, but in how it saw itself. The questions he had raised lingered. Who speaks for whom? Who gets to lead? What does freedom look like when spoken in a language we didn't script? And in the pause between Pete's final words and the fading applause, you could feel the unease of an empire unsure whether it was being challenged or merely being asked to listen. It didn't happen overnight. It never does. But slowly across continents, once tied together by chains and trade routes, something began to stir, a rhythm, a pulse, an echo of Traoré's voice, carried not by microphones, but by memory. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, students at the University of Kinshasa staged what they called a dignity march. No flags, no violence, just young people walking through the capital in silence, faces painted with red stripes beneath their eyes, a nod to the beret they now saw as a symbol of resistance, not war. They carried signs that read, "We are not commodities. Power should not come with strings." In Bamako, Mali, a youth-led collective launched the Voices Without Borders campaign, uniting activists across West Africa to demand a full regional audit of foreign military agreements and development deals. They didn't quote Traoré directly, but they didn't need to. His language had become part of theirs. One organizer said it best: he didn't teach us to speak. He reminded us that silence was never neutral. Even across the Atlantic in Haiti, a group of university students painted a mural of Traoré alongside Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. The caption underneath read, "The future owes us nothing, but we owe it our courage." What began as a political moment was now becoming something else, a shift in consciousness, a reawakening not grounded in any single party or platform, but in a shared feeling that the time for asking had passed. That dignity was not something to be granted. It was something to be claimed. In Ouagadougou, the transformation took a physical form. It started as a rumor, then a photo, then a crowd. A group of local artists, sculptors, welders, muralists had gathered at an abandoned lot just outside the city center. With no government funding, no permits, and no official blessing, they built something tall, angular, and unapologetic. A statue of Traoré, but not the uniformed president. They sculpted him barefoot, sleeves rolled, one fist at his side, the other hand extended not in defiance but in invitation. His eyes were carved not as angry but focused. A plaque below bore no title, no office, no dates, just 3 words: "Walk with us." When asked why they made it, one of the artists shrugged and said, "Presidents come and go, but symbols stay when the people decide they're ready." By week's end, the statue had become a gathering point, not just for citizens of Burkina Faso, but for travelers from Niger, Ghana, and Senegal. Children ran beneath its shadow. Elders came to touch the bronze hand, not out of worship, but reverence. Young women recited poetry. Veterans stood in silence. And through all of it, there were no chants of conquest, no cries for vengeance, just a quiet sense that something had broken open and it would not close again easily. Across the world, think tanks scrambled to understand the phenomenon. Some dismissed it as a populist surge. Others tried to fit it into neat ideological boxes: anti-globalism, post-colonial resistance, Afro-nationalism. But the truth was harder to contain. It wasn't a revolution of guns. It wasn't organized by states. It wasn't about returning to the past or burning down the present. It was about a generation scattered, fractured, long underestimated, choosing to speak in a voice that hadn't been filtered through permission. And in that voice, the clash of ideologies that once seemed like a debate between talking heads had become something far more powerful: a wave, relentless, rising, and already on the shore. Traoré does not speak at a podium nor on TV. Instead, he pens a public letter published in newspapers, posted online, translated into multiple languages. But it is not addressed to presidents, pundits, or powers. It is addressed to the young. He writes to those who feel small, to the next generation of leaders who think change is reserved for the powerful. You do not need to conquer. You only need to believe. The future is not a throne, it is a mirror. Make sure when you look into it, you see your people standing with you, not behind you. The letter is humble without self-glorification. He never names Hegseth. He never mentions critics. Instead, he speaks of service, sacrifice, and responsibility. It ends simply: "You owe no one your silence, but you owe your people your voice. Use it well." And in classrooms from Nairobi to New Orleans, it is read aloud by teachers and remembered. In the weeks that follow, the world reacts, divided as ever. Critics call Traoré a master of performance, a charismatic man in camouflage who rode a wave of populism. They warn that symbolism fades, that words without systems collapse. They ask, where's the policy? The roadmap, the proof. But supporters call it revolution, not of bullets, but of spirit. They say Traoré didn't need to rewrite a constitution to spark change. He reawakened belief. In a quiet village in Burkina Faso, far from cameras or headlines, a young girl walks to school. Her backpack is frayed. Her shoes are worn. But in her hand, she holds a small paper flag she made herself. Scrawled across it in blue ink are the words, "I am not small." She is too young to understand geopolitics, but she understands pride, dignity, possibility. And that might be enough. The narrator returns not to explain but to ask, was this about power, or principle about a man, or a movement? Was it a moment destined to pass, or a spark that reached dry kindling, too long ignored? The camera pans across real images: African youth leading marches, peaceful sit-ins in Haiti, street art in Sao Paulo, A statue in Ouagadougou, draped in flowers and the glow of mobile screens, playing that 90-second speech in dorms, classrooms, homes. There is no dramatic end, no victory parade, no villain defeated. Only a shift. And the final words return, not shouted, but spoken softly like a truth that's always been there waiting. Sometimes it takes just 90 seconds to awaken the world, but it takes courage every day to keep it awake. Sometimes history doesn't shout, it whispers through courage. Ibrahim Traoré's quiet strength reminded us that dignity doesn't require dominance, only clarity and conviction. In a world quick to judge and slow to listen, his 90 seconds weren't just a response. They were a reminder that even the underestimated can carry the weight of a people's hope. What would you say if the whole world finally listened, even for just 90 seconds? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.